Our next speaker is a visiting professor at the University of Porto in Portugal, KANNA RAJAN, I hope I'm saying that correctly, who will be speaking about explorations in AI for marine robotics. Hi.
Okay, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Out there? Yes, no?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me? Okay, I take that to mean a yes. Okay, couple of things so first of all, you and my talk are sort of coupled because we're doing things together to a large extent, but to a large extent also oceanography is about one fundamental question, which is where and when to sample, something that you mentioned. There was a question about robots going in straight lines. The reason robots go in straight lines is because people make them do it. And the algorithms that they've been using traditionally has been the standard lawnmower patterns. And that is obviously quite bogus because things in the ocean aren't necessarily in straight lines. So a lot of this, what we're trying to do in statistical sampling and control is to get away from that. And it's not such a hard thing to actually get away. So the motivation for what you and I are doing fundamentally resolves around trying to understand upper water column processes, right? None of which are in straight lines. There's nothing really which is in straight lines. So you should look at that larger context and really the kinds of papers that have been in the literature for the last 10, 20, 30 years with AUVs in particular. Yes, it was establishing some kind of a baseline, but that's all it is. So it's not as if robots have to be going in straight lines. In fact, you'll see from Yu's work and the one that I'm hoping to showcase that that's not the objective. So I'm going to sort of give you a perspective about AI. And to be very clear, the AI here is not data science. It has very little to do with what you see as what's typically machine learning. And it is artificial intelligence in its classical form, where you're making decisions and you're doing decision making. And all of that decision making is fundamentally for one thing in this context, which is to deal with undersampling. So Walter Monk's statement, this is about the 20th century, essentially underlies the kind of work that we need to be doing. It's what really oceanographers have been doing for a very long time without calling it sampling. And so sampling theory and statistical sampling in particular is at the core of what needs to be done. But that's one part of the equation. The second part of the equation is to do it in ways that are sustainable. And that's part of what I'll be touching on. And that has to do with intelligent robotic sampling. So the motivation here is to bring cost-effective tools so that you can understand what's going on in the changing climate, and particularly the ocean. And there's a whole notion of here to be able to sense the environment, to plan and act. The plan part is really at the core of what is in this talk. And what the planning is and what it means is really what I'll touch on. Now here, there is a cyclical nature of the process. What you mentioned about SynMod and more models essentially give us a prior, a starting point, as he said. So do remote sensing images as a way to say, here's what the world looks like. And here's where we want to be able to sample or reduce the entropy or our uncertainty of our knowledge of the world in the ocean model. So all of this is sort of moving towards providing what's now very fancifully called as a digital twin, because we are collecting data by making a prediction which is invariably wrong, and then trying to close that loop of uncertainty. But to do that, the idea is to be able to sense the environment and make measurements with active sensing in the water column with robots, and then plan for where you need to go, which is really at the crux of what you was talking about, and then act, which is make more measurements. So there's a whole process associated with it, and it goes around a research team which is very multidisciplinary, and it comes from having spent quite a bit of time in the space science, where I spent 10 years at NASA, and then moving and bringing that perspective into the oceans with robots and AI. So that's where this is all coming off in the context of real world experimentation, where you start with the real world and then feed your academic research, and then it sort of goes round and round. So that's sort of where I'm coming from, with a whole range of other disciplines that you're seeing. And I work very closely with biological oceanographers in particular. I'm also starting to work with people in physical oceanography. So the talk of this talk is going to be basically give you some themes and motivations, talk about what planning is. It's an overloaded expression. How do you integrate planning with execution? Because of the sense, plan, act. The act part is important. How do you integrate what you plan with what you actually do? Then some applications to ground it, and then sort of give you a perspective where we are headed. But the first thing is, why decision theoretic AI? This is what is at the core of what we're doing. And the reason for that is actually pretty simple. It's bottom line, it has to do with dealing with uncertainty. Being able to sustain robotic devices for longer periods of time requires reducing the cognitive burden on human beings, because typically now 99.99% spacecraft, for instance, that NASA and ESA fly, they're all joystick. And of course, most AUVs are running waypoints, which is part of the reason why they're running in straight lines. But they shouldn't be, and they needn't be. And that's part of where we are heading. But in doing with that, you're essentially dealing with the notion of, you're dealing with the notion of this sampling conundrum of finite resources and finite time. So you're sort of balancing and juggling this act of how much can I do? And that's, you touched about it in terms of resources. When should I do it? And more importantly, also, how should I do it? So that balancing act is essentially at the core of this. What's the future? What is me, the robot, what am I going to be doing? And what is the current opportunity? So I'm in the water, I'm a robot, I'm in the water, I'm seeing certain things. And so my perspective, what I see now, and what I need to do over a mission, and that mission could be days, hours, and hopefully in the future, weeks and months, with vehicles that can sustain themselves in some form or fashion. So there's this balance that's going on all the time, but that balance has to go in the context of specific scientific problems that you're trying to solve. So in our case, the focus is to bring spatial statistics, control theory, AI, and have an impact with biogeochemical oceanography, and do this in a way where you are sampling a large chunk, a mesoscale of the ocean with multiple vehicles, and to do it in very systematic ways so that you can scale because of the costs involved. And we all know here that costs are a significant portion of why we are not at sea most of the time. So all of this has sort of brought us into being capable to do certain things, and that capacity has to deal with how we can sustain ourselves to do observation at scale and cost. And that's what brings me to the motivation for doing machine intelligence onboard vehicles. So when people talk about planning, they're not really doing planning, and in the sense of computational aspects of planning, they're planning in the sense that they are saying, okay, here's one waypoint, here's the next waypoint. That's not what this talk is about. Okay, so the genesis for a lot of this work is from NASA, including 2 flight projects where my software flew in deep space, 65 million miles, and on the surface of Mars. So there's substantial legacy here, and I am not going to go too deep into it other than to show you some pretty pictures. The picture on the left that you're seeing is with the late John McCarthy, who coined the term artificial intelligence at the Dartmouth conference in the late 70s, early 70s. And he passed away a couple of years ago. And essentially, we flew on the remote agent experiment, which was the first onboard planning system anywhere. We flew Lisp, the Lisp language, which again, McCarthy invented. So that's the reason for that photograph. So a lot of this, the legacy of what I'm going to show you is coming from the space sciences. And from deep space to the surface of Mars, is the trajectory of the research that I've been engaged in. And this is the same research that I've pulled you into from the world of statistics. So that's really where we'd be talking about. So ultimately, the notion is to be able to have a coordination across space and time with multiple assets. So that sort of gives you the motivation of where I'm coming from. Very quickly, what is AI planning and what are the basic elements? Very, very simple in a couple of slides. Then I'll talk about the system that we've designed and have implemented, which is unfortunately the only AI planner in the planet which is operational. There have been efforts here and there, but it is a little hard, and so it's not. It is unfortunate that this is the only systematic planner that's actually working on in the ocean sciences. So briefly speaking, the conceptual idea of planning is what you think it is, which is you have a certain state and you want to take your system, and your system could be a robot, it could be a human being, it could be your car that you get into. You want to take that initial state and transform it into something else. So those something else comes in the form of goals or objectives, and the initial state and the objectives get fed into a planner, and the planner generates some plan. All of this is very mystical, I know, but hopefully it'll clarify. The plans are a sequence of tasks or actions that a controller must perform on a system or what's called a plant. And the plant is operating in the real world. And so essentially it has to deal with events that are asynchronous and coming in. Those events get filtered through the system, the robot in this case, and they are observations that the controller and the planner need to factor in because the world is constantly changing. So you are observing, you are a robot, you're observing the world. At the same time, you're projecting some plans, and you're tasking your robot to do certain actions. So those come through the plans. Those plans get transformed into actions. Actions have an impact on how the robot changes its world by moving, by turning, and so on and so forth. Those events come in from asynchronously from the real world. The world is not static, and those get filtered up through the chain. So this whole loop is essentially part of the Sense Plan Act, the concept that you're seeing on the left-hand side of the screen. And the Sense Plan Act is a continuous process that you're looking at interacting with the world. And what that has done is resulting in an architectural paradigm that you're seeing in the right-hand side. Deliberative, reactive, and skill control, there's layers. It's what's called a 3-layered architecture. So most AUVs are in the bottom 2, reactive and skill control. That's it. So the novelty of this work has a lot to do with the fact that you're adding deliberation on board. Okay, so very quickly, planning basics, and this is essentially to show you what planning is. This is a very, very simple dock workers robots domain. It's a toy example. And what you have is a crane with the ability to lower and pick up some kind of a box, and there's a vehicle. The vehicle can be in two locations. The crane is in a separate location. So essentially, the problem here is moving a box that a crane has, perhaps, or it's on the ground, and moving that to a separate location using the truck. Right. So it's a sequence of actions that you're seeing, and each action has a precondition and a post-condition. So to be able to, in the top that you're seeing, to be able to take the truck and to be able to put something on top of it, if the truck is in location 2 and the box that you're seeing in the top figure is on location 1, there's a sequence of moves that you have to make. And the reason this is non-trivial is because this has what's called a state space explosion. So as the number of objects increase, the number of actions increase, this can blow up computationally. So planning, the general notion of what planning is what's called p-space hard, which is essentially, it's unsolvable. But the reason we are talking about planning in the first place is because you actually factor in using heuristics, and you close the domain in certain ways. That is, you only talk about certain objects. So planning itself, the general notion is extremely hard. And so we try to make it simpler by looking at how you want to put enumerate the number of objects that are in the system that you're reasoning about. So this is all about reasoning, which is why it's decision theoretic. We are doing search, which is you're making a trade space. It's like the Red Riding Hood in the middle of a forest, and at the middle of a juncture where there are 3 different paths or 5 different paths. One of them takes her to the wolf, the other one takes her to a grandmother. Which one should she take? Right? So you're making choices. So this is at the core of artificial intelligence. It is not data science, which is at the core. It just happens to be that when we are conflating the notion of data science and machine learning with AI, they get messed up. So choices, representation, and search is at the core. So you have, in a planning problem, when it's given to a machine, you have a description of the system and the states with an initial state, the goal state, and you have a set of objects in it, a set of actions, and you're essentially trying to figure out which actions to use to transform an initial state, S0 in this example, to something that you really want to go to, in this case S5. So how do you get the truck, which is in location 2, to come back to location 2 with a box on top? It looks simple. It doesn't work that way. So essentially, you are making a series of commitments to move and take action, right? And what you're seeing is a policy or a plan on the left-hand side at the bottom, which says, start from S0, do a take, which is going to move you from state S0 to S1, and from S1, you do move 1, and that takes you to the next state, which is S3, and so on and so forth, right? So it's a sequence of actions. I'm going to change turn the knob a little bit about planning. In this case, I'm bringing the notion of time. This is an actual plan that we flew 65 million miles away in space. And this has to do with the fact that we want a spacecraft to be doing certain things approximately at certain times and given a set of goals. So what this is a series of timelines. Time moves from left to right, and essentially you have a desire to have the engine. It's a very specialized engine, which has a maximum amount of thrust. And in the SEP segment, this is the solar electric propulsion segment that you're seeing from the second from the top. You have a series of angles that you want the thruster to change the direction that the spacecraft is going. And at the bottom, what you really want to do is you have a notion that you want to take an image because you're looking at stars to triangulate to figure out where you are in deep space. So this is your initial state. And all of this is simply eye candy at this stage. It's not about understanding so much as to get a conceptual idea of what this is happening. When the planner gets to work, essentially it works sort of like this. This is again a cartoon, but this is an actual plan that we flew. And this is 1/10 of a real plan, which allows a system, embedded system, to do the right thing at the right time. Right? So in this case, what it's doing is it's taking an image, and to take the image, you are thrusting and you're going into standby with the engine, the yellow line at the bottom, and it is doing it at certain times so that you can achieve the state that you want. And that state that you want was the initial goal state, which had a certain amount of thrust and the fact that you needed to take a picture. All the fuzzy lines that you're seeing are constraints as to when you can do it and under what conditions. Those are the preconditions, post conditions, but also there's a factoring in of time. We don't have time in this talk to talk about time, which is ironic, but time is an incredibly important part for embedded robotics because things in the real world don't work the way they do, right? So you have to factor in and reason about time, but planning as such in typical environments was considered to be something that when we started off in the 70s was the world is static, as you see in this video, which is really the first embedded planner ever at SRI, which is in the Bay Area. And the notion was the world is static and the robot is essentially going around and figuring out how to go from point A to point B. And the fact was also at that time, robots would have to stop to plan. So the world was supposed to be very quiet while the robot was planning, as you're seeing right now. And then when it finds an obstacle like like you're seeing in the video, then essentially it has to throw out the old plan and then start again. So this is where it all started, but where it has actually gone is now we are able to plan continuously, very much like what human beings do when we are looking at tasks that we need to do. Say when you get up in the morning, you're saying, okay, I have a bunch of things to do. And as I'm executing a certain plan in my head of what I need to do, there are invariably things that go wrong that you're to recover from. So replanning is a fundamental aspect of planning that we all do every day, all the time. You're probably doing it right now. So this is where planning came from. Then there's a concept of execution, where you're executing the plan. And then, of course, there's failure associated with plan execution that has to be factored in. So all of this is part of the entire infrastructure of planning. And so what I'd like you to think of is that planning is a composition of the sense plan act process, because there are different levels at which you need to plan. So here's an example of an ROV, and there are at least 4 actors here. There's the vehicle itself, there's an arm operator, there's a pilot, and a scientist. Right? At a minimum, most ROVs work the same way. Each of them is different in the sense of what they need to accomplish. They are operating at different speeds. The vehicle has to be very responsive to actuation and control, or when it's touching something or doing something. The arm operator and the pilot have to coordinate to achieve a long-term goal that the scientist has provided. So what that means is that there is a temporal and a functional scope. Functionally, these are all very different things that people are doing and at different timescales. So when you look at and factor those in, then deliberation or planning and execution are sort of all pulled together tightly, intertwined. And so what one actor does has an impact to the other. And that's the basis for the system called the Teleoreactive Executive that we designed some 10 years ago, which is essentially a system that deliberates across multiple control loops and multiple functional loops in one agent. This could be in multiple robots, but we are not talking about multiple robots. We're talking about a single robot. So at the bottom, you have a vehicle control interface is essentially another planner. These blue boxes that you're seeing, each of them is called a reactor. All of them are deliberative systems, or can be reactive or deliberative. Reactive is when you're impulsively giving out a command. Deliberative is when you're thinking about it, planning for it, and then doing something. And each of them are separate control loops. The one at the bottom, because it's touching the hardware, is the fastest. The one at the top is the most abstract. It's thinking in abstract terms, and it's the slowest. Plans go down, observations go up, consistent with the diagram that I showed you earlier about what planning is. Okay, so that's really what I wanted to touch on T-Rex. You're seeing a couple of examples in the terrestrial domain. One is an old version of the PR2 robot with T-Rex running on board. And so essentially it's coordinating a bunch of different activities to be able to go and recharge itself. And then there's a test bed in Las in Toulouse with a small rover, which is moving around a lab space, obviously, and it's able to accomplish a set of very simple tasks. So all of this is here in terms of the kinds of things that we want to do. How does this apply to the ocean sciences? Now I'm going to switch into, so we've talked about the motivation, we've talked about the basics of planning. Let's talk about applications, and after applications as to where we are going from here. Okay, so what you're seeing now is in the Monterey Canyon, which is, Monterey Bay is the world's most sampled, most studied region on the planet, simply because there are 3 oceanographic institutions in the same area. And there is a deep canyon. It's about 3,000 or 4,000 meters deep. And what you're seeing is, top right, something called an intermediate nepheloid layer. Essentially, it's mass of the bottom mass of organisms, particles, gunk that has fallen down. It is getting uplifted because of the notion of water pressure pushing the water up. And that whole process is called upwelling. And the upwelling is essentially shoving water through the canyon, which tapers off on shore, but starts off at the deep end around 3,000-4,000 meters. And then essentially it's pushing up the particles. And you're seeing the backscattered image of an AUV transect on top of the canyon. And the notion here is to capture what particles there are to understand how upwelling influences the surface layer in the water. So the kinds of problems that you're dealing with have to do with the fact that there's episodic events. There are things that you cannot really plan around. You can't draw straight lines because none of this is really straight lines. The survey that you're having was manual with waypoints, straight lines, but the process that we want to capture has no such straight lines. And what's the process that you want to capture? So we built the system that you're seeing at the bottom and that's a MATLAB image of the vehicle, an AUV, looking at the process with 10 water samplers on board the AUV to be able to pick up at the most interesting parts, pick up the water sample, and then bring it back to shore. Completely unmanned. It's a reactive process, it's not really looking too far ahead. What it is doing is, in terms of deliberation, which is planning, which is tightening the transects. This is the straight line. These are all straight lines. When it sees an interesting chunk of the water, it tightens it so that tightens the lines so they're closer so that you can actually get high resolution data. And towards the left-hand side, you see the yo-yos that you're seeing of the AUV is much wider simply because it hasn't found anything interesting. So there is a very weak deliberation, the reaction and deliberation aspect of it that we demonstrated very early on. So this also follows in Monterey Bay, looking at a thermal gradient, which is again not a straight line, to be able to map it and to in near real time pop up at the surface and ask a human user to be able to say where precisely they want to take water samples. So again, it's a mix of onboard deliberation with reaction, and also in this particular case, getting a human being involved over an iridium connection to make a decision as where to sample, where to draw a line and where to sample. So you keep hearing me say sample, and the sampling part is the crux of what we're doing. But to be able to do it, you need a certain form of control. And what you're seeing now is what you talked about earlier, is looking at ways in which you can assimilate with a Gaussian process model on board an AUV, and to be able to assimilate the data in real time so that you can create a 3D surface. So this is work that we did with our PhD student at that time, 3-4 years ago, Trygve Fossum. And Trygve did an excellent job in embedding with T-Rex a mechanism which includes a Gaussian process model, and to be able to sample in fine scale. And you saw use slide, and this is essentially a follow-on slide to that. In terms of sampling these kinds of environments, it always helps when you have more data. More data, in this case, the example that you're seeing is multi-vehicle operations, which are not really multi-vehicle in terms of communicating between each other, but essentially one vehicle having a certain set of sensors going at a certain speed, and the other actually having the water samples to be able to take surgical samples at the right place at the right time. Again, this is also a sampling problem. Out at sea, the two vehicles talking over a satellite comms to shore, but completely hands-off, no human being involved in looking at a thermal gradient and also a nitrate gradient that you're seeing. Other examples that we were engaged in is with looking at a wire walker, which is a vertical wave energy vehicle, which is going up and down and then essentially in Lagrangian motion moving in the water column because of currents, underwater currents. And to be able to chase that with a vehicle that you're seeing, the AUV, which is pretty large in space and time. And the concept here is that we want to understand how close should the AUV come to this randomized motion of the wire walker, because both of them had calibrated CTDs, and to be able to make sure that you're not too close and not too far. And if you recall what you said, if you sample in Trondheim and make a sample somewhere else, which is hundreds of thousands of miles away, there's no correlation really. If you're nearby, there could be correlation depending on what kinds of current structures, what kinds of gradients there are, and depends on what kinds of environmental conditions are. But understanding how close and how far you are to make the most optimal use of space and time for the measurements is really critical. So this is all work that encapsulates that, and this is in the open ocean with what's called an environmental sample processor, which is essentially a lab in a can. So it does genomic analysis, and what we've done is, when I was at MBARI, put it on a float and essentially chase the ESP again in space and time. So The control aspect here is not something that can be scripted. And going back to the person who asked about straight lines, well, yes, there is some straight lines, but fundamentally what you're seeing is we are no longer operating in the straight line regime and shouldn't be and would not be. So all of this is sort of coordinated in some way. The coordination is important in a loose manner that you can't tightly script everything. You want to be able to have a certain amount of wiggle room to be able to move in space and time because of the huge amount of uncertainty. Similar coordination in looking at chlorophyll biomass, which is moving, and what you're seeing on the right-hand side is an image of a Google Earth image of the Monterey Canyon, that's Monterey Bay. Two vehicles, essentially, one having a certain set of sensors, the others having a different sensor moving at different speeds, but one telling the other where to go because of the sensing capability that it has. And so this is sort of the consistent theme of having at least some notion of grounding a truth and then being able to correlate what you're seeing, which now what you're seeing is essentially an animation of an experiment we did in 2014 of southern Portugal, where biologists had tagged sunfish, which tend to float around in the surface. They are cold-blooded, and the idea was really to understand how do they operate, why are they where they are, because they're a harbinger of climate change since they consume jellyfish, which are proliferating. So the notion here wasn't necessarily the technology end, and more notion was more on the science end. So what I'm trying to tell you is the kinds of work that we need to do and we should be doing is looking at the science. What are the critical problems to solve? Engineering has certain limits, and it's time that we actually move beyond that. So a lot of what you're seeing now is a mixture of pure science, ocean science, working with robotic elements. In this video, you're seeing this is in the open ocean in the Pacific, 1,500 miles from San Diego on the Schmidt Ocean Institute vessel. And this was in 2018, all essentially driven by LSTS, which is the lab in Porto. Maria Costa, I believe, is there. And we fielded 10 AUVs in the water at the same time with aerial and surface vehicles. So now you're getting a quantitative leap between sampling with one vehicle, with the number of vehicles there. The T-Rex kind of deliberation is less useful here, more in terms of coordinating some of these assets. So there is a different part of the story, but what I'm trying to bring in here is the fact that we have the notion that we can control at least one agent. Now we are talking about ensembles to look at large spatial scales. Here, the fronts were at the mesoscale, 20, 30 square kilometers and beyond, with the ship somewhere in the middle. And so the robots were an extension of the human senses going out and trying to understand what's the spatial and temporal scale of the dynamics of the front. So you have to first find it, then you track it, you sample it, and then you essentially, in the process, characterize the front. So these are all dynamic events that you're trying to map, but they are driven by the notion that we have to explore processes and upper ocean dynamics that have a significant impact on how the ocean is changing. And you're seeing these kinds of experiments we've been doing with the Portuguese Navy, with aerial and surface and underwater vehicles. And essentially, FIUP in particular has been exceptional, and it's pretty much the apex lab in marine robotics to be able to do these kind of things. And to a large extent, this is years and years of work. And they've just finished, for example, looking at working with 17 navies off of Lisbon with multiple vehicles, robotic vehicles. I'm going to skip this sort of get to a very quick overview of where we are so we can wrap up in the next 5 minutes. Where are we heading? So I've given you a motivation. I've talked about planning. I gave you some applications of why planning is important, because you need to balance the here and now with the future. And so where is all of this going? Where this is going, as you can expect, is in the sense plan act loop. We have to figure out a way to do online learning. Well, start with offline, but then online. What you're seeing with Yu's talk and my talk is we are heading in that direction, where a form of statistical learning is what we are engaged in, using models, humans, and AI planning system, whether they're on shore or on board. So that's sort of the general notion of where we are heading technologically. What are the large tasks with societal impacts that we want to look at? We have 6 of us have gotten together across disciplines to pull together a concept called Meteor. And I'm going to talk briefly about it and leave you with that. And this has to look at the urban sea, where there's a huge amount of pollution. There are dynamic events that are taking place as a part of the human presence, anthropogenic impact. And there's also natural events that are taking place, which are also dynamic. Fronts, for example, in the coastal areas especially are there. And so what we are looking for is a way to be able to predict and provide information to policyholders, to the common person, maybe even a fisherman, to figure out what is the state of the sea, the urban sea. We all can get our local weather anytime we want. We can, the local Met Office will tell you whether it's rain, sunshine, what's the temperature. We have no such conception of what the sea is doing, especially outside our window, especially in the coastal ocean. And there are reasons why you can't, but I think those reasons have been there because we didn't have the techniques and the technology, which I believe is changing. Some of it has to do with the fact that the ocean is large, and we can only field so many measurements. So the main question comes back again to what you and I are talking about, which is when to sample, where to sample. So what we need is adaptive, relocatable system which can integrate different sources of information, including ocean models, and to be able to have a societal impact. So you can bring up an iPad or a tablet, and whether you're a fisherman or a trained oceanographer, you should be able to get the information you want about the area that you're looking at. And to do that, we believe you need a system of systems, which starts with having a predictive capability in ocean models, and which use the sense assimilate. And the assimilation is important because you're doing it in real time. Make a prediction and to sample. All of this is real time, near real time. But to do the real time aspects of it, you need these assets looking at a patch of the ocean at the same time in a loosely coordinated manner. So my interest is in coordination, but the whole entire picture is about having an information system on your tablet or on your desktop to be able to make a prediction of what's going on at mesoscale as you look out of the window in the coastal ocean. There is no such thing. There are elements of it. There's a fair amount of data that's available, but we are talking about information, which is synthesized, processed, quality controlled, and presented in a way that's assimilative. And small sats are one way in which we can provide the information at scale in near real time. We believe that with a set of small sats, which can be in multiple orbits, 12 of them to be precise, we can, instead of the best we can do now is about anywhere between 1.5 days and 5 days of observations, remote sensing data of the coastal ocean. We believe we can bring that down to 3.5 hours with 12 small sats in different orbital planes. And we know how to build them. We know what kind of sensors we want. Yes, there are significant challenges in the algorithmic aspects of removing atmospheric perturbations, cloud cover, and so forth. But those are all problems that we can solve. So what we want to be able to do is to bring all of this together in ways where there's decision theoretic AI has vehicles on board, being controlled either from shore or in situ, which can individually go to the places where there's a huge amount of uncertainty, and to be able to provide data which is assimilated in ocean models, which is synthesized and projected, and the skill level, the predictive power of the ocean models is increased over time. And then that in turn gives you those probabilistic estimates, which have very tight bounds as to what you can do and when you can do, and make a prediction. So this system of systems is a little complicated, but yes, we know how to build this. And it has high resolution data, which is complementary to the ways in which we are doing things. And it actually adds a level of information and capacity in a completely open manner, where all the software we build will be open source. And it brings together a whole range of disciplines, some of it which you're seeing on the screen on the left. We presented this to the National Academy, US National Academy's Ocean Shots in February. And this is a system that the US government and the Department of Defense, which has, of course, a lot of interest in this kind of stuff, they are considering, and we are hoping to see where to take this from here on. So these are the 6 guys, many of whom you would have probably seen. João, you would have seen, is my close collaborator for the last 10 plus years from Porto. Ajit Subramaniam is here in New York, is an oceanographer at Columbia University. Joachim Tintor is a physical oceanographer with operational oceanography experience. Pierre Lermessou is at MIT, and he's the modeling person and does adaptive sampling and assimilation. And Fernando Aguado is in the University of Vigo in Spain, who has a phenomenal success records with small sats. He has 6 in the sky right now. So put together this team, we've been working to pull this vision together, which is essentially an observatory. Instead of a telescope looking up into the sky, we want the telescope looking down. But the telescope is a system of systems with space, aerial, surface, underwater vehicles, and with different forms of resolution, different synopticity. And to be able to look at, for example, at the lowest, at the micro level, I initiated a project in Norway, which is using an AUV, also from Porto, which has in situ vision, machine learning, and control to be able to chase microorganisms that a scientist from shore can actually say, okay, I want you to target a pseudonychia, which is in this part of the ocean, go and give me the relative distribution over time and space. Okay, so that's it. There you are. Okay, I'm going to stop and see if there are any questions.
Thank you. Can you hear us? You can hear us? Okay, questions? We don't currently have... Oh, yep. Oh. No, I'll come to you next. That's all good. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is regarding the computing resources you need for the mission planning on the autonomous vehicles. What kind of how much power do you need? What kind of processors or something like that?
More than enough right now. Wow. Okay, so can you hear me without getting snowballed with the echo? Yes? Can you just say yes, no with your fingers? Good. Okay. So we have more than enough right now. You have, we can operate on a Raspberry Pi, but even better if you have a Jetson on board. So I would say, to give you a concrete number, probably 1.5 gigahertz CPU with probably about 32 gig of memory. That's probably more than adequate. Now, as you mentioned, when it depends on the application. As you mentioned, if you want to get more aggressive in terms of looking ahead in your Gaussian process, yes, you need more memory and you need ideally more CPU. All of that now exists. It's not the hardware, it's the software that's the problem. So I don't think hardware has any significant issues these days. Hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. It was a nice talk. One group you might want to talk to is there's a group at Stevens Institute of Technology that's been running basically an oceanographic model that covers the area from essentially Delaware all the way up to Rhode Island, all the way up the Hudson River, 100 miles. It updates every 6 minutes and does a 48-hour forecast, 24-hour hindcast. And they've been doing that for about 15 years. You may find that the group that did that, they actually formed a private company now to commercialize that idea. So you may find some synergy there with what you're trying to do, because they've got, I mean, I know them. I don't do that stuff, but just letting you know they're there.
Jupiter Intelligence, I think that's what it is. Right.
Okay, so thank you so much, everyone. We're actually going into our lunch break now, so I'm going to wrap things up there. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our speaker from New York. And everybody's waving. Yeah, thank you very much.